have something else, which is traveling in search of hadith. I will not talk about it since I've already talked quite a bit already. But even the Sahaba, one Sahabi, he traveled for 1 month in search of one hadith to hear directly from the person who heard it from the Prophet. Even more than that, another Sahabi, he went from Mecca to Egypt to ask someone about a hadith that he had heard from the Prophet. And when that person heard it narrated to him, he said to him that you and I are the only two people who left who heard it directly from the Prophet. In other words, he knew the hadith, but he went to that person and just to make sure that the hadith is still being memorized properly. You find many examples like that. Ibn Abbas, one time, he was asked, this is not exactly of traveling hadith, but shows you their desire for learning hadith and knowing hadith. Ibn Abbas was one time asked, how do you know so many hadith of the Prophet ﷺ? Because when the Prophet ﷺ died, Ibn Abbas was still very young. And he did not live with the Prophet ﷺ in maturity for a long time. So he said, I learned many hadith through great hardship and going through stress and standing in the cold wind. What he meant by that is what he used to do is stand outside the door of the other Sahaba, the older Sahaba, and wait for them to come out. And when they come out, then he starts asking them about hadith that they heard from the Prophet. Also during that time we have the development of the hadith gatherings where the teacher or the person who heard the hadith would transmit this hadith to others. Abu Hurairah, for example, used to have such a gathering. Abu Hurairah himself, he used to spend, by the way, 1/3 of the night praying, 1/3 of the night sleeping, and 1/3 of the night studying hadith, memorizing hadith. So all of these things are from the beginning of the time of the Prophet ﷺ, or from the time of the Prophet ﷺ. So these things are good guarantee that the hadith of the Prophet ﷺ were being preserved, as I said, from the time of the Prophet ﷺ. There's no gap. Another important question, though, which we must address, is that when did the fabricating of hadith begin? This is an important question. When did the fabricating of hadith begin? I remember when I first became Muslim, some people told me, and by their statement you'll know who these people are. Some Muslims told me that there were so many hadith fabricated that there's no way the scholars could tell which hadith were authentic and which were not. Okay. Now, if the fabrication of hadith began, before these other sciences were developed, or before hadith were recorded, or before the Jarh wa Ta'dil was being used, or before the Isnad was being used, then we might have a big problem. But when did the fabrication of hadith begin? No? After what? Well, according to one writer, his name is Ahmed Amin. According to Ahmed Amin, the fabrication of hadith began during the time of the Prophet. Okay. Now, obviously, if we want to prove when the fabrication of hadith begins, at least the story that we use as evidence should be true itself. The story that Ahmed Amin uses is the fabrication itself. And his evidence itself is a fabrication. And he's trying to prove when hadith begins to be fabricated. So we throw his evidence out. Other scholars such as Abu Shahba and some others, some of them said it began during the time of the fitna. And during the time of the civil war between after the death of Uthman. What's the evidence for that? The evidence for that is that after the death of Uthman, or during the time of fitna, Muslims were divided into two groups. That's not much of an evidence. Is that sufficient evidence to say that hadith were fabricated? Because the Muslims were divided into two groups, does that mean that they started fabricating hadith? Their argument is that they were divided into two groups, and each group began to fabricate hadith against the other group. Does this make sense? for the most part we're talking about Sahaba. Many of them were Sahaba. And in the fitna or the fight, the civil war that took place was a civil war for the sake of truth. Both groups thought that what they're fighting for is al-haq, is the truth. They used to fight during the day and then pray together at night. And it was not a fight based on I hate these people, I hate this group. No. It was a fight for the sake of truth. So they're not going to fabricate hadith necessarily in that case. And if we ask the people of this opinion, can you provide us any evidence that anyone fabricated hadith during that time? Can you give us the name of anyone who fabricated hadith? Can you give us any evidence that hadith was fabricated during that time? They cannot bring any evidence. And even during that time, we already stated that the Sahaba themselves would not have fabricated hadith, as proved from the Quran. Even during that time, there was many Sahaba who were still alive. Do you think it's possible for someone to fabricate a hadith, someone who is not from the Sahaba, to say the Prophet ﷺ said this and this, while so many Sahaba are still alive? No, they would challenge him. They would say, where did you get this statement? All of us were alive during the time of the Prophet ﷺ. None of us heard this. So there's no evidence that states that the hadith began to be fabricated during this time. The only evidence that we can find is during the last quarter of the first century. During the last quarter of the first century, somebody asked somebody else to fabricate hadith in favor of one of the political leaders. We don't have evidence that he actually fabricated hadith, but we have evidence that someone asked somebody else to fabricate hadith. This is the strongest evidence that we can find, or the earliest of the strongest evidence that we can find. And therefore we can conclude, especially since many of the Sahaba were dead by then, and many new people had entered in Islam, and the government was not correcting hadith and searching and make sure the hadith were transmitted properly during that time, we can conclude that at the earliest, during the last quarter of the first century, was when the fabricating of hadith began. During the last quarter of the first century, which was, as I stated earlier, was after hadith were recorded on a large scale amongst the Tabi'een. It was after the science of Jarh wa Ta'deel had already begun to be used. It was after the Isnad had already begun to be used, and so forth. So in other words, the scholars already had in their possession the tools to spot who are the people who fabricated hadith, and it was easy for them to spot those hadith and to remove them. In the question and answer period, if someone remembers, if someone would like to ask about how many hadith were actually fabricated, you may do so. I will just end with one final comment and then open the floor for questions or comments and so forth. This final comment is that some people say that the existence of fabricated hadith and the existence of weak hadith is an evidence that the Sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ was not preserved properly. Okay. I claim, what am I to claim, but I claim that the existence of weak hadith and the existence of fabricated hadith, or hadith which have been classified as weak and classified as fabricated, is an evidence that the hadith of the Prophet ﷺ were preserved properly. Because if the scholars did not do this, if the scholars did not sift through what is authentic and what isn't authentic, then you can say that yes, the hadith were not preserved properly. Like the case of the Bible or the case of the Christian church. The early scholars did not sift through what is proper and what isn't proper, so therefore they have no idea what is correct or what isn't correct. But the scholars of Islam, fulfilling this promise that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala would preserve the Sunnah, as we discussed earlier, they distinguish between those reports from the Prophet ﷺ that were correct and those which were not. And this, as I said, is a sign that the hadith of the Prophet ﷺ were in fact preserved, and is not the fact, a sign that they were not preserved. Inshallah, with that, comment, I will end the talk and open the floor for comments or discussion and so forth.
Allahu Akbar. Thank you very much, and really very enlightening. Yes, please.
It's the Quran, it's the word of God. Why do I need a hadith with strong hadith, or weak hadith in the first place to explain the word of God? Why the word of God is not clear enough by itself? Sure, those people who ask me, they ask me to doubt, not to get informed, to doubt the importance of the hadith in the life of the Muslim. So I'm looking forward to have answer from you.
Well, no doubt this question was asked by a Christian. Of course, you and I both know who asked the question.
Exactly.
For the rest of the audience, yeah.
Yeah.
Well, the question really has no relevance with respect to Islam, with respect to the Quran, Sunnah, because what do you mean by Word of God? Do you mean by Word of God His revelation, or do you mean a certain book? Because Word of God means, and you could mean by that revelation in general. So therefore the Quran and the Sunnah are both revelations. And the Sunnah was revealed to the Prophet ﷺ in the same manner, and it came from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala like the Quran. Now, one of the Tabi'een, he said, and this is not something you can say from ijtihad, he said the Sunnah was revealed to the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ in the same manner as the Quran. So then the question becomes, is the revelation of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala clear? And the revelation of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is both the Quran and the Sunnah together, and yes, it is very clear.
And that the revelation, some of the revelations as the Quran came only to the Prophet, and some of the other revelations came to the Prophet and the Sahaba.
No.
Is that right?
No.
Because the Sahaba were involved in hadith to preserve it.
Also the Quran, that's the point I made earlier, right? When the Prophet ﷺ received the verse from the Quran, he told it to his followers, and they were the ones who recorded it. So they did not receive the Sunnah was received by the Prophet ﷺ. And both of them are revelation, and they are complete in and of themselves.
Well, I think it's a fact that God promised to preserve the dhikr when allow the hasbun. But it's another fact that hadith was not written in the time of the Prophet, and we all know why, because he didn't want the Muslims to be mixed up between what he said and what God revealed to him. But I think it's the hadith that we have now and that we all repeat in all the hadith books, it's the result of science and study and collection of human beings like us. I believe in all the hadith that's not hadith da'if. I'm not saying what's in Bukhari and Muslim. I'm not saying that out of suspicion or doubt about the hadith. But the way to look at the hadith that we have now, it's not really the words of the Prophet, just the words of the Prophet. It's the result of the development of a science called Ilm al-Hadith. And through this science, we scholars in the past try to look at who are the ruwah of the hadith and their history, and categorize the hadith from hadith jayyid to hadith hasan to hadith da'if. So this is a science, and the way I think we should look at now is a science always is a fact that accepts challenge and further studies. My point is to take the hadith and try from the scholars in the past has not only we don't just take the hadith, we took their interpretation of the hadith to the point that nobody else, whenever you try to say any different interpretation of what the Prophet might have meant by such a hadith, based on your understanding of Islam as a general rule, you always get struck by people who are saying, no, so and so said so and so 800 years ago, understanding this hadith. And in that way, it's just the quote that what the scholar said in the past as if it was Quran, which means this is a statement you cannot, these people have more knowledge than you have, read more, they're closer to the ruwah than you are, and not considering that hadith is a science, and the collection of hadith we have now is the work of human beings. I'm not saying that I don't trust these people. I trust these people because, and I feel grateful to them because they, through their work, we got to know what the Prophet said and teaching our Islam. But I'm saying that it should put for challenge sometime within the spirit of Islam without getting or trespassing the basic understanding of Islam. We can look at the hadith that we have now in a different way, different from what the scholar said, because it's the work or the outcome of work of human beings. And that's I mean, if God knew that we need to have these teachings 2,000 years later on, there must have been a way to document it as Quran. But God meant it to be, this is Quran statements that will never be changed as through history. Nobody came and said that this is Quran da'if and Quran guide. Quran has been Quran. But hadith itself, I think he left it up to the works of the Muslims that came after the Prophet for a purpose of different interpretation on the based on our understanding, our needs.
Actually, you came late. First point. Many of the points that you made, I should say humbly said, I refuted. For example, hadith were recorded from the time of the Prophet, and then we discussed that for actually quite a few minutes. And you have something you're saying is actually very confusing. You seem to be saying that the Sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ were preserved by human beings, but the Quran wasn't. The Quran somehow was preserved by something else. No, the Quran was preserved by human beings also. Both of them. Thirdly, your other point does not have much to do with the science of hadith itself. When you talk about how the hadith is to be interpreted, okay, that's not even the role of the muhaddithin. To be specific, the role of the muhaddithin is not to give the meaning of the hadith. That's the role of the fuqaha. The role of the muhaddithin is to preserve the hadith as properly as they can from the time of the Prophet ﷺ. So your other point about saying that maybe if someone 800 years ago said this is the meaning of the hadith and therefore that may be correct, may not be correct, actually that has nothing to do with what I was talking about. It's a completely different thought.
My concern is that we as living Muslims in the United States, in our community, I think we come short in creating the love of Prophet Muhammad in ourselves and particularly in our youth, and consequently then the importance of hadith. And as you started out, the concern we have in contemporary world, how we are, both some Muslims as well as certainly non-Muslims, try to weaken this and create more problems. Do you have some practical pointers for us, me today, to strengthen us and certainly help our youth to develop this understanding of the law and of Prophet and the importance of hadith? Some practical pointers. Yeah.
Well, that's another talk. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, قُلْ إِن كُنْتُمْ تُحِبُّونَ اللَّهَ فَاتَّبِعُونِي يَحْبِبْكُمُ اللَّهَ وَيَغْفِرْ لَكُمْ ذُنُوبَكُمْ. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says that if you claim or if you say that you love Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, then follow me and follow the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will love you and forgive your sins. I don't know what more a Muslim should need than this one verse. The verse clearly states that if you love Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and you want Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to love you, then you should follow the Sunnah of the Prophet. Another hadith said, not another hadith, but a hadith of the Prophet said, as recorded in Sahih Muslim, Must be lunchtime, huh?
For the kids, yeah.
Can someone bring my lunch bag?
Can you put lunch outside perhaps?
More like it. Oh, you're on? Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Actually, as I said, your question requires a whole lecture by itself, but I just gave you that one verse and another. I'll give you one hadith from Sahih Muslim in which the Prophet ﷺ said that everyone will enter Jannah except for those who refuse. Everyone who will enter Jannah except those who refuse. So he asked me, who would refuse? He said, whoever obeys me will enter Jannah. Whoever disobeys me has refused. So this hadith and this ayah and many other ayat and hadith show us the importance of following the sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ in our lives. With respect to actually love for the Prophet ﷺ, this is a matter of aqidah actually. This is a requirement. Everybody must love the Prophet ﷺ, as when Umar ibn Khattab told the Prophet ﷺ, he told the Prophet ﷺ that I love Allah and you more than anyone except my own soul. And the Prophet ﷺ said, not yet. And you haven't gotten to that, the complete thing, until you love Allah and His Messenger more than anything else, even your own soul. So then Umar ibn Khattab said, I love Allah and you more than even my own soul. So as I said, actually that is a different topic. This is a good topic for, by the way, for khutb, for those of you who give khutb here. Go ahead.
I have a comment first and then a question, if I may. The best evidence that Quran and Hadith were revealed both to Rasulullah alayhi salatu wasalam comes from the Quran itself. وَمَا يَنْطِقُ عَنِ الْهَوَى إِنْ هُوَ إِلَّا وَحْيٌ يُوحَى. This is my comment. And my question
Can I
to you...
reply to your comment?
Oh, go ahead, please.
The only reason why I particularly don't use this verse is because it is easy to reply to that verse. Okay. According to most of the ulama, it is referring to both the Quran and Sunnah. Everything that he speaks is a matter of revelation. But this is the Surah Al-Najm. If you read the whole surah and you keep in mind what was the surah about, what was the incident, it is a situation where the Quraysh, the Kuffar at that time, were criticizing or doubting the validity of the Quran itself. So some ulama say that this verse does not apply to both Quran and Sunnah, it applies only to the Sunnah. But we have many other verses, as the brother mentioned during the stampede, that talk about Al-Kitab wal-Hikmah. And Al-Hikmah here is only one thing, it's the Sunnah of the Prophet. And there's many verses that talk about the fact that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala revealed Al-Kitab wal-Hikmah.
Going back to Surah Al-Najm, it's a complete...
Which ayah?
Oh, I'm sorry, I didn't translate.
It's the ayah that he mentioned means that the Prophet ﷺ does not speak from his own desires, but everything is the revelation.
And we know that the Quranic verses, speak in a complete, comprehensive way. We don't take it in a context of Surah Al-Najm. We take it in the context of the whole Quran and the whole concept.
Can I comment on that?
Oh, go ahead. It can be like that overnight.
Well, I understand your point, but if you study ulum al-tafsir, the way to understand many verses is you have to look at the asbab al-nuzul. If you take it away from what it was about, and in many cases you may miss the meaning of the verse. So I do not agree with you completely to say that.
Thank you. And the question, my question is really, you asked yourself the question: how many fabricated hadith are there? Remember this question you asked us earlier?
Yeah.
Thank you.
Actually, you see, it doesn't really fit into the talk, so I tried to leave it for the question. Actually, the point that I was trying, or that I would like to make here, is that what confuses many people is that there was many people who were crucified or who were killed as punishment for fabricating hadith. And they're called zanadiqa or zanadiq. So some of these people, before they were killed, they made tawbah. And they said, for example, some of them said that I fabricated 4,000 hadith making what is halal haram, what is haram halal. Okay? And some Muslim scholars themselves, even some muhaddithin, this is the most amazing thing. Even some muhaddithin record these things that these people said, and they take it as true. One of the conditions for accepting what someone says, he has to be adil, he has to be dhabit, and he has to be a man of integrity, and he has to be someone who's proficient. Who is this man who's saying, I fabricated 4,000 hadith? The man is a liar. The man is someone who spent his life trying to attack Islam. That's why he's being crucified, or being killed, I mean. He's being crucified. Still thinking of Anish Rosh, you know. Now, if you were in that case, I'll get you, brother, inshallah. I'm finished. If you were in that case, suppose we're one of them, what would be a last-ditch attempt to make the people doubt the Quran or the Hadith of the Prophet ﷺ? The last-ditch attempt is to claim that you fabricated so many Hadith. And then everybody will start doubting every Hadith that they hear. So these statements made by many of them that they fabricated so many false Hadith, and even if you look through all the books and try to find, some of them made a number, even if you take all the collections of Hadith together, you barely have this number of Hadith. So the number of fabricated Hadith is not as great as many people say, even many Muslims, because they're fooled by this statement, and obviously not as many as the enemies of Islam said. So there are at least 1,000 fabricated Hadith. Okay, there are at least 1,000, but it's nothing when compared to how many authentic Hadiths there are. And also many of these 1,000, are from much later time. And after all the Hadith were recorded, after everything was scientific. In fact, it's still going on today. People are still fabricating Hadith today, but it's very easy to spot them today. So many of these fabricated Hadith, even if their number is 1,000, came from a much later period of time, and it's very easy to spot them.
Before I go to you, Brother Akhtar, your father made a comment, and I think the brother answered. Do you need any more elaboration? Okay, go ahead, Brother Akhtar.
Well, brothers, we strongly believe in Quran and Hadith, and the interpretations of the fiqh, which was done several hundred years ago, created so much differences in Muslimin that so many sects of Muslims were created. Is there any work being done today to make up those differences, or interpretation of Hadith in the light of 20th century or 14th century?
Yes? The fiqh differences? Yeah. It is, these differences are being removed on a large scale. And if we look to what's known as asbab ikhtilaf al-fuqaha, or the reasons for the difference of opinion amongst the fuqaha, many times, for example, one scholar knew a hadith and the other scholar didn't know the hadith. So one scholar follows the hadith, the other scholar makes ijtihad. His ijtihad may be correct, it may not be correct. This is even back to the time of the Prophet. Abu Huraira gave fatwa that if someone wakes up after the time of Fajr began in the month of Ramadan, and he needs to make ghusl, then he should not fast that day. Okay. That was his fatwa. When other people heard this, they went back to the wives of the Prophet and they asked them about that. And they said, no, we did that happened to us on occasion, and we fasted that day. So yani Abu Hurairah did not know this hadith, so he had to make his own ijtihad. His ijtihad was incorrect. As soon as he heard the hadith of the Prophet ﷺ, he changed his opinion. One time in the case of Umar bin al-Khattab, there was one issue that was brought up, and they were trying to decide the issue, and someone narrated a hadith from the Prophet ﷺ, and he said, if we did not know this hadith, we would have decided it according to something else, and we would have had a different decision. And there's other reasons for difference of opinion amongst the fuqaha. For example, in certain areas, the chains of the hadith were not that well organized. For example, Abu Hanifa in Iraq, and Iraq was trouble spot at that time. Most of the new sects in Islam came from Iraq during that time. Much of the fabricated hadith began during that time. As one of the ulama of hadith, Zuhri said, he said that the hadith leave the Hijaz this long and they come back from Iraq this long. So Abu Hanifa did not, for example, have reliable sources of hadith as much, for example, as say Imam Malik did or Imam Ahmed. So therefore he would reject certain hadith because they came to him in such a way that he had to reject them. They're not correct according to the chain that goes to him. So he rejects these hadith and he makes ijtihad. If he knew the chain of Malik or Ahmed, he would accept the hadith. So what's happening now is many ulama, alhamdulillah, they are realizing what caused the difference of opinion of the fuqaha, and they're going back to the Quran and the authentic hadith. And if the opinion of the faqih goes against the authentic hadith, then they leave his opinion, they follow the Quran Sunnah, which is what they're obligated to do. Excuse me. So if they have this spirit and they try to do this, which is being done, alhamdulillah, now, in many cases, many of these differences are disappearing.
I don't know if any of the sisters has a question. Okay, Brother Fakal, I'll come to you.
Misconception that the Quran is called fard, that's obligatory. The Sunnah is the kind optional, that if you do, it's a plus, if you don't do, there's no harm. Comment on this, please.
Can I ask you what this area is? Can you be more specific? Because this is not the view of... Which...
They say it's misconception, but here it goes on as a wide way.
It's not a tradition.
So this is of course against the Quran, because if it's obligatory to follow the Quran, well, it's the Quran that obligates us to follow the Sunnah. So therefore they're both obligatory. I cannot say anything more than this is very... Okay, just... No, it's okay, go ahead.
Assalamu alaikum. I come from Pakistan also, and I have observed and seen that this is not the case, as Brother Zulfikar said, that it is considered Quran is farad and Sunnah is not. Sunnah is followed more vehemently in Pakistan and India than in other parts of the Islamic world.
This is why I wanted to know exactly what part of Pakistan. Now there are people in this part of the world who call themselves Ahl al-Quran, and they refuse to follow the Sunnah completely. That's something else. I don't think that's the problem.
I think Hamid wants to.
This question is about Salat is and Salat is hair. Do you believe this or something else?
No comment.
I stress the point with conception.
Yes.
The back of your mind, they still have that point. And the way even open it says, that although it's wrong, but again, somehow this misunderstanding is so widespread. I don't want to specify the geographic area, specific group that will do it, but there are very many groups and very many areas that still they confuse the Sunnah, the word Sunnah itself.
Well, you know, Sunnah means different things to different people. The Sunnah, if a faqih says Sunnah, and I don't know if this is the source of their confusion, but if a faqih, a jurist says Sunnah, he means it's not wajib. Say, for example, 2 rakat after dhuhr is Sunnah, that means that action is not wajib. It's not simply mubah, it's something confirmed in the actions of the Prophet ﷺ, so they call it Sunnah. But that's from the fiqh point of view. Now, if they're getting confused, I mean, that's the only thing that I can imagine. They're getting confused between the two different uses of the word Sunnah. For their boss.
Assalamu alaikum, brother. Thank you, Brother Jamal. It was a very excellent talk that you gave us. And, I was going over various points that you have made, and some questions are coming, and I thought I'll share with you. Maybe we can have an answer also. To me, it appeared that as far as the documentation of the Sunnah is concerned, most of it, maybe all of it, was done during the time of Prophet Muhammad ﷺ or soon after that. If that was the case, then how would you characterize the role of Imam Abu Hanifa or Ahmad or many other scholars who came much later after him, or his Sahaba, the first 3 generations even? That is one thing that is a little unsettling in my mind. Is it that the whole thing got scattered there, the documents, the record got scattered and they had to go back again? Or somebody didn't compile everything? Let me just add on one thing here. For example, okay, all right, please.
I've already well, I'm not clear about your question, but the nature of the recordings of the hadith changed over time. At the beginning, for example, the Sahaba, they would just record some of the hadith that they heard directly from the Prophet. And the Tabi'in used to record the hadith they heard directly from the Sahaba. Although what they used to do is go to different Sahaba and collect. And the earliest recordings used to be gathered according to who narrated the hadith. It was known as Muslim. You put all the hadith of Abdullah bin Mas'ud here, you put all the hadith of that, and so forth here. And also after that time, some of the early works have hadith, and they also have other statements. They have statements of Umar bin Khattab, they have statements of some of the Tabi'in. Okay? And then you get after that books of just pure hadith, and then you get hadith of pure sahih hadith, and you get hadith of pure legal hadith. So the nature of the collections, and when I said that they were recorded, I didn't mean that they were recorded in the sense that they were preserved in writing.
They were not compiled.
Yeah, they were not compiled. They were not, what they call tasnif was not done during the time of the Sahaba. And this is what confused some of the writers, Muslim writers, because they said that the first one who made tasnif for hadith was someone who lived around 132, 140. So some of them concluded, this means that hadith were not recorded until this. Tasnif. A tasnif means to gather things together. No, because Asyuti, he always called himself Musannaf, because all he ever did was just bring stuff together. Sometimes when Asyuti's writing, you read one thing on one page and then the next page contradicts what he wrote. Because he's just bringing things together. Anyway, okay, the word that I'm pretty sure that they use is tasnif. If it's wrong, I'm sorry.
Okay, now let's look at the whole thing in a different light. Now, as far as the preservation of Quran is concerned, again, as you reiterated, it was done through human beings. They wrote it up and all that. Now, we all know that it was during the time of Khalifa Osman that he took upon himself to have an authentic copy and distribute it all over so that there won't be any confusion. Why when we had to wait in case of hadith that long? Or why
if you have something to say.
Why no authentication was attempted even? Well, it was recorded. It was scattered records.
Well, first of all, the hadith is quite a bit different from Quran, because Quran is something, it's fixed, the amount is fixed, and it was all together with one person and so forth. And many people had the whole Quran by themselves or in memory. Hadith is different. One Sahaba spends a day with the Prophet ﷺ, he hears some hadith, those hadith are with him. Another Sahaba who after the Prophet ﷺ died, he moved to Basra, he has his own hadith that he heard from the Prophet ﷺ. So it was an impossibility almost, especially that time. But even though that's the case, Umar ibn Abdul Aziz was the first Khalifa who officially asked certain people to collect all the hadith of the Prophet ﷺ together. So Umar ibn Abdul Aziz being the Umayyad Khalifa. Basically it's because it was much more difficult in the Quran. But at the same time, as I mentioned earlier, they were making sure that the hadith were being preserved properly.
And you made an excellent point. The Quran could be memorized by one person, and that really is the big difference there. Thank you.
Hamid, do you have something?
Let me guess what your question is.
Go ahead. The classification of hadith as mutawatir, hasan, sahih, sahih and da'if and so on. And the use of it, could you just elaborate on this? And the use of it in aqidah and in fiqh. And if there is any difference between them, what is it? And if there is no difference, why? And how? I think you talked about it yesterday, but I think this is the time to put it in place.
Yeah, another topic. So first of all, there's two different classifications. One is mutawatir and ahad, and the other one is sahih, hasan, or da'if. So let's deal with the first one first. Mutawatir and ahad. Mutawatir refers to hadith which have been transmitted in such a way that there's no doubt about the authenticity of what has been transmitted. In other words, it was transmitted in such a way that there's no way the people who transmitted it could have gone together and, for example, made this thing up. Like the Quran. All of the Quran is considered mutawatir. Okay? Now, some of the scholars of hadith put a particular number. For example, they say in each generation at least 4 people must have narrated and so forth. But this is not correct. Ibn Taymiyyah, actually an excellent passage, he shows that reports can be mutawatir for different reasons. For example, if you have two Sahaba, one lives in Basra and the other one lives in Egypt, and they pass on hadith to their students in Basra and Egypt, and you only have 3 of their students, but their students are from the best scholars of the hadith. And there's no way that the people of Basra, the students in Basra, did not meet the people in Egypt. There's no way they got together and fabricated hadith, but they narrate exactly the same thing from the Prophet ﷺ. Not maybe just not a short sentence, but a major statement or a major hadith or long hadith. Then he said, we can also consider this mutawatir. We don't need 4 people, 5 people, 6 people. This is irrelevant, and there's no evidence for that in the Quran that you need 4 people in each generation. But it's the nature of the report. For example, the Sahabi, what's his name? Khuzama? There's one Sahabi that the Prophet ﷺ said his witness is equal to 2 men. His name is Khuzama or something. Khuzama is the hotel I stayed in Riyadh, so that may not be correct. His name was something like Khuzama. If you get the report from Khuzama, and you may consider it authentic because the Prophet ﷺ guaranteed that what he's saying is equal to 2 people. Similarly, Abu Bakr. Ali ibn Abi Talib, I didn't mention this earlier, but Ali ibn Abi Talib used to make the people say an oath that they heard the hadith directly from the Prophet ﷺ. And when they narrate hadith, Ali ibn Abi Talib used to make them say an oath that you heard this directly from the Prophet ﷺ. Except in the case of Abu Bakr, and he doesn't have to, because if Abu Bakr said it, it is correct. So Abu Bakr himself, what he reports, and you could call it mutawatir. It doesn't have to be 4 people, as I said, in each generation. So ahad, but in general, what it means, those are maybe exceptional cases, but in general what it means is that so many people narrated it that there's no doubt about the authenticity, that it was narrated properly, it was not fabricated, and so forth. Ahad, what is called ahad, is anything which is not mutawatir. And if it doesn't meet the minimum requirements for being mutawatir, we call it ahad. Ahad, no. I told you, I'm used to being correct. Yeah. Well, I used to say jarh. I used to put the ha before the ra. So, at least, alhamdulillah, I solved that one. But ahad, I still have a problem. Inshallah. So those are the basic classification. If a hadith is mutawatir, it is sahih for sure. Okay? It is sahih for sure. And there's some collections of books which are collections of mutawatir hadith, for example, the Suyuti has such a collection. Now, the reason why this is important in matters of aqidah is because الحمد لله نحمده ونستعينه ونستغفره ونعوذ بالله من شرور أنفسنا ومن سيئات أعمالنا من يهده الله فلا مضل له ومن يضلل فلا هادي له وأشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وحده لا شريك له وأشهد أن محمدا عبده ورسوله. أما بعد. Well, I have to mention at the beginning that the brother failed to mention that 2 years ago or 3 years ago he refused to give me a room at the Islamic convention.
You never forget it, you know.
Actually, we just were debating about what topic we should discuss today, and we finally conclude, inshallah, that the topic we're going to discuss is the ways or how Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala preserved the sunnah of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And this is an important topic, especially these days, for one basic reason, I guess, and that is that the sunnah is a constant source of attack by both non-Muslims and also by many Muslims, and you'll have some unfortunate misunderstanding. With respect to the non-Muslims, they realize that if you divorce the sunnah from Islam, then you can interpret the Quran in almost any way you wish. As Ali ibn Abi Talib, he told Ibn Abbas, when Ibn Abbas was going to debate with the Khawarij, he said, when you debate with them, do not stick to just the Quran, but make them go to the Sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ. Because if you just stick to the Quran, it will be too open, and people could interpret it any way they want. So make them stick to the Quran, to the Sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ, which explains the Quran. And many people, many enemies of Islam today, they also realize that fact, and therefore they are trying their best to attack the Sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ, to divorce the Sunnah from Islam, and therefore, in essence, divorcing Muslims themselves from Islam. And at the same time, we can say there is, amongst Muslims themselves, there is some, we're talking now about the general Muslims, there is some ignorance or some lack of knowledge concerning how the Sunnah was recorded, or how the Sunnah was preserved. Many Muslims to this day, still, if you talk to them about, for example, the recording of hadith, they'll say that hadith were passed on orally for many years, for maybe 200 years or so, and it's not uncommon to find Muslims saying that. On the other hand, with respect to the Quran, if anyone tried to attack the Quran, every Muslim would say, no, the Quran has been preserved since the time of the Prophet ﷺ. But when someone tries to attack the Sunnah, because of our ignorance, sometimes we don't give exactly the same response. So therefore, it is important for us to realize and to study how Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala preserved the Sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ. So I'm not going to talk about the importance of the Sunnah in Islam. I hope, inshallah, everyone should be, at least they should be very well familiar with the importance of the Sunnah in Islam. I just want to talk about how the hadith or how the statements of the Prophet ﷺ were preserved. If we look to the Quran again, how the Quran was preserved, everyone knows that the Quran was preserved by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, but how was it preserved? It was preserved by the Sahaba, it was preserved by human beings. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala used the human beings to preserve the Quran. In the same way, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala used the human beings to preserve the hadith of the Prophet ﷺ. Now, even before discussing this point, we can ask ourselves, is there any proof or is there any guarantee that the hadith or the sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ was guaranteed? What I mean by that, for example, is there any guarantee in the Quran that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala preserved the sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ? Well, we can argue that there is two proofs that the sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ has been preserved. One of these is naqli, or based on a verse of the Quran, and the other one is aqli, or based on logic. The first of these from the Quran, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم إنا نحن نزلنا الذكر وإنا له لحافظون. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says that verily we revealed the dhikr and we will preserve it. Now the question arises, what's the meaning of the word dhikr in this verse? Dhikr in the Quran could mean, or has different meanings. As we find, in, for example, in Fairuz Abadi's book on the Quran, the Dui Tamiz, dhikr has many different meanings in the Quran. A dhikr could mean the Quran itself. It could also mean the hadith or the sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ. As Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in the Quran, وَأَنزَلْنَا إِلَيْكَ الذِّكْرَ لِتُبَيِّنَ لِلنَّاسِ مَا نُزِلَ إِلَيْهِمْ. That we have revealed unto you the dhikr in order to explain unto mankind what has been revealed to them. Well, the dhikr in this verse, the last verse I mentioned, most likely it refers to the sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ, because the sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ explains the Quran, puts the Quran in practice. So when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, we've revealed unto you the dhikr in order to explain what was revealed, or in order to explain to mankind what was revealed to them, it means we revealed or gave you the sunnah in order to explain to mankind the meaning of the Quran. So dhikr in some verses in the Quran, it could mean sunnah. And there's other examples where dhikr refers to the sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ. So now we have to go back to that verse and ask ourselves, when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, إِنَّا نَحْنُ نَنزَلْنَا الذِّكْرَ وَإِنَّا لَهُ لَحَافِظُونَ, what is the meaning of dhikr in this verse? Well, it could have three meanings from the Quran itself, as we see. It could mean the Quran, it could mean the Sunnah, or it could mean both the Quran and the Sunnah. Let's take the first case. Suppose it means the Quran. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says that we reveal the dhikr, or we reveal the Quran, and we shall preserve it. And most likely the meaning of dhikr in this verse is not just the Quran. Because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is going to preserve the Quran is both the letters of the Quran and also the meaning of the Quran. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will not just preserve the letters of the Quran, but Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will also preserve the meaning of the Quran. And the meaning of the Quran is found where? The explanation of the Quran is found where? It's found in the Sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ. For example, I don't want to get into this topic of how the Prophet ﷺ explained the Quran, but just to take one example. In the Quran, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala orders us to cut the hand of the thief. And the word used in the Quran is yad. What's the meaning of yad in the Arabic language? That's for anyone. Hand? We have any experts in the Arabic language, like Ani Shurush? Yes. After pointing out all the grammatical mistakes in the Quran, well, I'm not a scholar of the Arabic language. Okay, let me. Sahih? Okay, if you, this is why I don't like to be filmed, Hamid, because I like this stuff. And if you go to the books on Arabic language, like, for example, there's another verse in the Quran talking about wudu, how to make wudu. Okay? What does it say? It says, what does that mean? Wash your hands. You're saying hand is to here, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is saying wash your hands to here. Say, the meaning of yad in Arabic means from here to here. Any part of it. And it means, if we want to translate it, it means arm. So how do we know that the verse in the Quran that says to cut the hand of the thief, it means the hand? We know because the Prophet ﷺ was sent to explain the Quran, and he is the one who explained it as meaning up to the wrist. And there's many examples like that we could discuss, but I want to get into other things. Unless you want to stay until Salat al-Isha discussing this. So when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala promises to preserve the dhikr, and it could not mean just the Quran itself. Because as we said, it doesn't make sense just to preserve the letters of the Quran, because the Quran is both the letters and the meaning. So a possible meaning is the Quran and the Sunnah. both the Quran and the Sunnah, or it could mean just the Sunnah itself. In either case, whichever of those latter two it means, it is a promise from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, or actually it is khabar, it is a statement of fact from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that He is the one who is going to preserve the hadith of the Prophet. There's other verses that talk just about the Quran, that nothing can enter from behind or from front or behind, that specifically just talk about the Quran. But this hadith in particular, this verse in the Quran in particular, includes, we can say that at least it includes the Sunnah of the Prophet. So there is a promise from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, or a statement from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that He is the one who is preserving the Sunnah of the Prophet. The second argument, which is what I call aqli or logical argument, is if we keep in mind the commands of the Quran, as Ibn Taymiyyah wrote in Majmu' Fatawa Ibn Taymiyyah. Obviously he didn't write it in Majmu' Fatawa Ibn Taymiyyah. He's not the one who wrote the collection of Majmu' Fatawa Ibn Taymiyyah, but as is found in that collection, Ibn Taymiyyah said the position or the place of the Sunnah in Islam has been confirmed in over 40 places in the Quran. Logically speaking, from what we know of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, from what we know of the Sharia of Islam and what Islam is all about, does it make sense that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala orders us to follow the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, orders us to follow the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam in many verses of the Quran, and at the same time Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala allows the Sunnah of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam to be lost? And it doesn't make sense. This is what is known in logic and Arabic language as abata. It is something that we cannot conceive of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala because it doesn't make sense. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala لا يكلف الله نفسا إلا وسعها, does not burden the soul beyond what it can bear. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is ordering us to follow the Sunnah, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will not order us to follow the Sunnah unless He made sure that the Sunnah still exists among us. So there is some evidence that in fact the Sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ, and the Sunnah of course is captured in what we call the Hadith literature. There is some evidence that the Sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ must have been preserved. Then the next question is, how was it preserved? Well, like in the case of the Quran, as I stated earlier, it is preserved through the actions of human beings. So if we go back to the time of the Prophet ﷺ, we can start to see from the time of the Prophet ﷺ how the Sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ was preserved. First, and a point that the Orientalists seem to ignore, is that the Sahaba believed in the Prophet ﷺ as the Prophet or Messenger of God, and they believed that the words he spoke were inspired by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So therefore, during his lifetime, they would do his best to listen to and to capture and to memorize everything that they could that the Prophet ﷺ said. For example, obviously they had to take care of their own lives also, so they could not always be with the Prophet ﷺ. But even in those cases where they were not with the Prophet ﷺ, many of them would make arrangements to make sure that they would not miss what the Prophet ﷺ said during those days. For example, Umar ibn Khattab, he had one of his neighbors from the Ansar. They used to take turns going to the Prophet ﷺ. One day Umar ibn Khattab would go to the Prophet ﷺ, listen to what the Prophet ﷺ said, and then when he goes back home in the evening, he tells his Ansari neighbor what the Prophet ﷺ said. The next day the Ansari would go to the Prophet ﷺ and listen to the Prophet ﷺ, and then when he goes home he tells Umar ibn Khattab what the Prophet ﷺ used to say. And this is recorded in Sahih al-Bukhari. So from the time of the Prophet ﷺ, if we realize the position of the Prophet ﷺ, we should realize that from that time the Sahaba were very eager to learn the hadith of the Prophet ﷺ. And also, as recorded in the Sahihain, the Prophet ﷺ used to speak in such a way that it would be easy to comprehend and it would be easy to remember. And many times he used to repeat things 3 times so the people could grasp what he said. Not only that, sometimes when people heard hadith of the Prophet ﷺ from another Sahabi, from another companion of the Prophet ﷺ, they would not be satisfied, and satisfied not with the authenticity of the report, but satisfied in hearing the hadith until they go back to the Prophet ﷺ and ask the Prophet ﷺ himself, did he say that? We find many hadiths in which someone came to the Prophet ﷺ and said, so-and-so said that you said this and this and this, is that right? And the Prophet ﷺ would say, yes. And we find other examples. For example, Al-Bara went to the Prophet ﷺ to ask him about the dua that you say at night before you sleep. And the Prophet ﷺ told him that dua. And so Al-Bara afterwards he repeated the dua to the Prophet ﷺ. So even during the time of the Prophet ﷺ, there was many means by which the people would do their best to capture the hadith of the Prophet ﷺ, try to memorize it, and the Prophet ﷺ would assist them, as I said, by speaking slowly and clearly, and sometimes repeating his speech 3 times. And of course, the easiest way to memorize hadith, as the muhaddithin point out, the easiest way to memorize hadith is by applying the hadith. And if you hear the Prophet ﷺ say, do such and such, or you should do such and such, you apply this hadith, and that way you will be able to memorize the hadith. And that, of course, is one example of the Sahaba, that whenever they heard anything from the Prophet ﷺ, they would immediately apply it. Now, there's one other issue that seems to concern many people. Before I get to that issue, I just want to state that suppose it was the case that the hadith of the Prophet ﷺ were not recorded. Does this necessarily mean that the hadith were not preserved? The Orientalists sometimes when they talk, and not just Orientalists but also their students amongst the Muslims who have been affected by them, like Ahmed Amin, they give the impression that if the hadith were not recorded during the time of the Prophet ﷺ, it's not possible that they could have been preserved properly. And they make this argument, that if the hadith were not recorded during the time of the Prophet ﷺ, just memory and so forth is not enough, and therefore the hadith could not have been preserved properly. As I said, some Muslim writers themselves have been affected by this idea, and they have passed it on to their students also. Well, the argument is wrong in itself, because just because something is not recorded and written down does not mean necessarily that it's not preserved. There's many poems from the time of Jahiliyyah that have been preserved until this day, and they were not recorded until hundreds of years after the death of the actual poet who recited it. So it doesn't necessarily mean that if the hadith were not recorded, written down, that the hadith were not preserved. That's the first point. In other words, the argument that they're making is not really consistent or not really valid by itself. Then the second question is, the second part to that was or were the hadith of the Prophet ﷺ actually recorded, or when did they start to be recorded? Well, there's some debate among Muslims on this issue, and it seems to revolve around the fact that there's some hadith that states that the Prophet ﷺ disapproved or disallowed the recording of his hadith. There's some hadith in which the Prophet ﷺ said, for example, do not record hadith from me. Well, if we study this hadith, we find that all of them are weak except for one. And that's the hadith of Abu Sa'id al-Khudri, which is found in Sahih Muslim. And this hadith of the Prophet ﷺ is stated that anyone who recorded anything from him other than the Quran should erase. So this has led some people to conclude that hadith, it was not permitted by the Prophet ﷺ to record hadith, number one, and that hadith were not recorded during the time of the Prophet ﷺ, and they were not recorded for many years after that time. Well, in any issue, whether it be in fiqh or aqidah or anything, and even other sciences, not just related to deen, in any issue it's not logical and it's not proper scientific method to take one piece of evidence and to make a conclusion just from that one piece of evidence. you have to look at, see if there's other evidence and that can give you the complete picture. So for example, if we look through the Prophet ﷺ and his time, if we look to see if there's any evidence that the hadith of the Prophet ﷺ were recorded, or that the Prophet ﷺ allowed the recording of hadith, or that the Prophet ﷺ himself had hadith recorded, then we have to weigh the two opposing evidences and see which one is strongest and what our conclusion can be. Well, there's many hadiths, for example, the hadith of Abdullah ibn Amr ibn al-As, who said that he used to record everything that the Prophet ﷺ said. And some of the Quraysh, they told Abdullah, the Sahabi Abdullah ibn Amr, that do not do that, because the Prophet ﷺ is a human being like us, and maybe if he gets angry or something, he says something that he does not mean to say. So Abdullah ibn Amr ibn al-As went back to the Prophet ﷺ and he asked the Prophet ﷺ about this. He said, I was recording everything he said, and the Quraysh said this. Quraysh here means the Muslims from the Quraysh. So the Prophet ﷺ said, write or record, for nothing but the truth leaves my lips. In other words, he doesn't say anything except the truth, even if he's mad or whatever, nothing but the truth. And that's not the important part of the hadith that I'm trying to get at. The important part of the hadith is that he told him to record the hadith. He gave Abdullah ibn Amr ibn al-As explicit permission to record the hadith or his hadith. We find another example during the farewell pilgrimage. The Prophet ﷺ gave a khutbah, and after the khutbah, now obviously the khutbah of the Prophet ﷺ is simply his speech, which nowadays we call hadith. After the khutbah, a man from Yemen, al-Bukhari records it as Abu Fulan. In other books he's recorded as Abu Shah, and they give his name explicitly. Abu Shah came to the Prophet ﷺ and he asked the Prophet ﷺ if he could have the hadith recorded for him. So the Prophet ﷺ told one of his scribes, and by the way, the Prophet ﷺ, the most recent research shows us that the Prophet ﷺ had at least 60 people who worked just to record, who were his scribes, writers for him. They wrote the Quran and other things. So the Prophet ﷺ told one of his scribes to record that khutbah for Abu Shah. On other occasions, we find that the Prophet ﷺ wrote letters to the Emperor of Rome, to the Emperor of Persia, to the Emperor or the ruler of Abyssinia. He wrote letters to some of his governors like Ali ibn Abi Talib and other people. Now when the Prophet ﷺ had a letter written for him, that says, for example, in the letter to Ali ibn Abi Talib, when he gives some of the rules, ahkam, fiqhiyya, rules of Islam, what are these rules? What he wrote in that letter is the same thing as what we call hadith. And it is his statement, it is his words that were recorded down and sent to Ali ibn Abi Talib. So actually all of these letters that the Prophet ﷺ had recorded for him and had written for him are examples of hadith which were recorded during the lifetime of the Prophet ﷺ. So what we find, and there's other evidence too, by the way, Mustafa al-Adami, Sheikh Mustafa al-Adami, his PhD dissertation is on this topic. It's published by ATP. This is called Studies in Early Hadith Literature, in which he brings all the evidence together. The evidence, or what we can conclude from the evidence, is that the Prophet ﷺ allowed the recording of hadith. Sometimes he even asked for certain of his hadith to be recorded, and that there were some Sahaba, Abdullah ibn Amr ibn al-As being one of them, and other Sahaba who had their own collections of hadith during the time of the Prophet ﷺ. And it seems that the hadith of Abu Sa'id al-Khudri, in which the Prophet ﷺ told them not to record anything from him except the Quran, either this was in the early period of Islam, because Abu Sa'id al-Khudri became Muslim a long time before the incident of Abu Shah, for example. So it could have been the case that when the Quran was first being revealed, that the Prophet ﷺ did not allow people to record his hadith. Or it could have been the case that what the Prophet ﷺ meant by that was an explicit situation, which is in some of the other narrations of this same hadith, in which the Prophet ﷺ was telling them not to record his hadith on the same sheet of paper, or not sheet of paper, but the things that they used at that time, as the Quran. And do not mix the hadith and the Quran on the same sheet. So hadith were recorded during the lifetime of the Prophet ﷺ. During his own lifetime, they were not necessarily recorded on a mass scale, but the recording of hadith, as opposed to what some Orientalists claim, started during the lifetime of the Prophet ﷺ. And it continued after his death. Mustafa al-Adami in his PhD dissertation records something like 36 Sahaba who had their own collection of hadith, including Abu Huraira, including Abu Bakr, and so forth. There's even an incident in Al-Ilm by Al-Tirmidhi in which somebody narrated a hadith to Abu Huraira. That's one of the methods, by the way, by which they transmit a hadith. Someone narrated a hadith to Abu Huraira, and he told Abu Huraira that this hadith was narrated to us by you. So Abu Huraira told him that if that is the case, then you will find it in my books. So he took the man to his home, and the hadith describes that the room was filled with papers, recording the hadith of the Prophet. So there were recordings, from the time of the Prophet, from his lifetime, afterwards during the time of the Sahaba, Abu Bakr, as I said, Abu Huraira, Abdullah bin Amr bin al-As, all of these people had collections of hadith, and they passed them on to their students. One of the most important of those is the Sahifa of Abu Huraira. We don't have time to talk about that one in detail, but it has been preserved from the time of Abu Huraira, and the same Sahifa has been discovered recently. So if you consider the recording of something as a good way of preserving it, or even if you considered a necessity for preserving it, well, the hadith or the history of hadith had met that condition. The hadith were recorded from the time of the Prophet. But that's not all that we find in the early history of Islam. We find also that the Sahaba. Now when we talk about the preservation of hadith, by the way, we're not just talking about passing on hadith from one person to the other, but we're talking about passing on the hadith properly, correctly, as the Prophet ﷺ said it, free from mistakes, free from additions, free from omissions. Okay. And we're not just talking about passing on hadith in any way, shape, or form, but we mean passing it on and leaving it as pure, unadulterated as the Prophet ﷺ said these words. So just the recording of hadith, by the way, is not sufficient for that. Well, the Prophet ﷺ warned the Muslimin about fabricating hadith or saying something that is from the Prophet ﷺ while in fact it is not from the Prophet ﷺ. He said in a famous hadith that whoever says a hadith on my authority which is not true, كذب علي متعمدا نعم فليتبوأ مقعده من النار. I was getting there, but I thought you were correcting what I already said. It's okay. I'm used to both correcting and this hadith of the Prophet ﷺ in which he warned the Muslims. By the way, in some narrations of the hadith, the word muta'ammadan is not there. Okay? It just says that whoever states a hadith from me which is not true, you cannot translate it as whoever lies on my authority. That they usually translate in that way, but lie in that case means to lie down, so it does not work. So it means whoever passes on a hadith from the Prophet ﷺ that is not correct, he shall take his seat in the hellfire. And the hadith gives the impression that the person himself will go and make his residence in the hellfire because of that sin that he committed. Now, as I said, in some narrations of the hadith, by the way, this hadith has been narrated through 117 different chains from about 70 different Sahaba. It is an important notion, it is an important idea. So the Prophet ﷺ said it on more than one occasion and made sure that his Sahaba passed this knowledge or this important notion onto his followers. Now the importance of the fact that muta'ammadan or intentionally is not in all the narrations of the hadith is because in the Arabic language, here we come back to Arabic again. The word kadhaba, what does that mean? How would you translate it? Lie? Like, is that right? Like yet, remember yet? So kadhaba means to say anything which is not the truth. What's the difference between that and lie? If you make a mistake, in English, do we call that a lie? In Arabic, can you use the word kadhaba for that? Yes? In Arabic, you can use the word kadhaba. And if someone says something which is wrong, that's why one Sahaba said about another Sahabi, kadhaba Abu Muhammad. And he didn't mean that Abu Muhammad was lying, but he meant, as is correct in the Arabic language, that what he is saying is a mistake. So what this implies and how the Sahaba understood this is that when they're narrating the hadith, they have to be very careful in narrating the hadith properly, exactly as the Prophet ﷺ said it. Many of the Sahaba, like Ibn Mas'ud and others, they used to perspire when asked about hadith, out of fear that they're going to add even the slightest, just a wow or something, the slightest change, maybe it doesn't even change the meaning, out of fear of this hadith, that they said something that the Prophet ﷺ said that, and in fact it wasn't correct. And to save themselves, always at the end of the hadith they would say something like, "Oh, kama qal." And this tradition began at the time of the Sahaba. So the Sahaba knew the importance and realized the importance of, when they're narrating hadith, that they narrate it exactly as the Prophet ﷺ said it. Okay? So where they're not just passing on information, but they're making sure that the information is being passed on properly by themselves. And also the state took an active role. During the time of the Khulafa al-Rashidun, the state themselves took an active role to make sure that people are transmitting or passing on hadith properly without making mistakes. We find from the time of Abu Bakr, the first Khalifa, some people call Abu Bakr the first Muhaddith, and because he was the first one who introduced the concept of checking narrators to making sure that they were correct. Like when the grandmother came to Abu Bakr and said to him that, or asked about her inheritance, and Abu Bakr told her that, "I find nothing for you in the book of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala or the Sunnah of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam." At that time, Al-Mughira ibn Shu'bah, he said that the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam used to allot her 1/6. So Abu Bakr asked him to bring a witness, another person to corroborate what he said. So he brought Muhammad bin Maslama, another one of the Sahaba, who corroborated his evidence. Not because Abu Bakr doubted Al-Mughira, but Abu Bakr was trying to make sure that hadith are transmitted, and people are very careful when they say that the Prophet ﷺ said or did this. Even clear example of that was the purpose is the case of Umar ibn al-Khattab and Abu Musa al-Ash'ari. I have to say the name al-Ash'ari very slowly because I have attempts to put the ain before the shin. So I have to be careful with that. Abu Musa came to the house of Umar ibn al-Khattab and he asked permission to enter. And he asked permission to enter 3 times and it was not given to him. So he started to leave. Umar ibn al-Khattab finally came out of his house and he found him and he said, "Where are you going? Why are you leaving?" So Abu Musa told him that the Prophet ﷺ said that if you ask permission to enter 3 times and it's not given to you, you should return. Well, we know how tough, is this for me or for him? Well, I have actually a cold, so now that I drank from it, I would not drink from it. So Umar ibn Khattab told Abu Musa, and we know that Umar is a very strict Khalifa, he said that if you do not bring a witness for what you're saying, I will have you punished. So Abu Musa, I'm sure he went to the other Sahaba like this. He told them the incident, and they said, he told the group of the Sahaba, this is what happened, and I need a witness, somebody else who heard the Prophet ﷺ said this. So they sent Abu Sa'id, he heard it also from the Prophet ﷺ, and he corroborated Abu Musa's evidence. Then Umar ibn Khattab told Abu Musa that I had no doubt about you. And he's not thinking Abu Musa is a liar or anything like that. He said, I have no doubt about you, but we have to be careful. I have to be careful in how the people transmit the knowledge of the Prophet. So this, by the way, this later develops into a science, very well known science in Hadith, Ulum al-Hadith, in the science of the Hadith, called the science of Jarh wa Ta'deel. And distinguishing between those narrators who are making mistakes, and this was the basis for it, trying to make sure that people are narrating hadith properly, spotting those people who are making mistakes, and spotting those people who are transmitting hadith properly. This kind of checking of hadith, by the way, I call it cross-checking. This is from my economics background. I call this one cross-checking because you go from one person and you check his hadith with somebody else. They also had something which I call time series checking. An example of that was Aisha. One time Aisha told her nephew excuse me. One time Aisha told her don't worry, we can edit. Hamid will edit anything. One time Aisha told her nephew Urwa that Abdullah bin Amr bin As is coming to make the Hajj. So go to him and ask him about some hadith he heard from the Prophet. So Urwa went to Abdullah and asked him to narrate some hadith he heard directly from the Prophet, and he narrated some. One of those hadith he mentioned is the hadith from Abdullah that the Prophet ﷺ said that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala doesn't take away ilm or knowledge by taking it from the hearts of the believers, but Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala takes away ilm by letting the ulama or those people of knowledge die, and then therefore leaving just ignorant people. So when Urwa narrated that hadith to Aisha, it seems she had never heard it before, and maybe it was something new for her. So the next year when Abdullah bin Amr bin As came back to make the Hajj again, I believe it was the next year or the following 2 years after that, she again told her nephew Urwa to go to Abdullah bin Amr bin As and ask him about that hadith, that same hadith, narrate to him again. So he went and he came back, and Abdullah had narrated in exactly the same manner. So Aisha said, now I'm sure that he memorized it correctly or exactly from the Prophet ﷺ. And because he narrated after 2 years in exactly the same manner, she used that as an evidence that in fact he had memorized it properly. So this is what I call time series checking. The important thing again is all of these incidents that I'm mentioning are from the time of the Sahaba, from the time of Abu Bakr, from the time of Umar, from the time of Uthman and so forth. So from the time of the Prophet ﷺ, people were checking and trying to guarantee that they transmit the hadith of the Prophet ﷺ properly. There's one final point that we should discuss about the Sahaba before moving on to the time of the Tabi'een. What I've described so far is what they call in the hadith literature making sure of that the narrator is dabit, or he's proficient, or he's passing on the hadith of the Prophet ﷺ properly. Now what about the integrity of the Sahaba? Is it possible that some of the Sahaba may have fabricated hadith? that one of the Sahaba invented a hadith of the Prophet ﷺ and said the Prophet ﷺ said this, when in fact he knew that the Prophet ﷺ didn't say it. Is this possible? Just shake your head, yes or no. Yes, it's possible. It's possible. So, if we look to the Quran, for example, by the way, in the Arabic language, when we say adl, that this person is adl, what do we mean by that? Just, or a person of integrity. But in general, it means the person whose character and whose honesty and whose dignity we are pleased with, and we are sure of. So, if we go to the Quran, we find in different verses Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala describes the Sahaba of the Prophet. In some of those verses, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala clearly says that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is pleased with them. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala knows all of the Sahaba, has all knowledge of all of the Sahaba. Is it possible for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to say about someone who's going to fabricate a hadith that he is pleased with him? So this is evidence from the Quran that it is inconceivable, I want to say impossible, that any of the Sahaba fabricated hadith. Okay? So since we're certain about that aspect, that they would not intentionally fabricate hadith, we have to ask ourselves about the other aspects. Perhaps they just narrated hadith improperly or they made mistakes, and that aspect I already discussed, that they were very careful and they even checked each other to make sure that the hadith they narrated was correct. They passed this love of hadith and this love of the Sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ on to their students. The students are known as the Tabi'een, the next generation of Muslims. And the Prophet ﷺ said that the best generation is his generation, and then the one after it, and then the one after it. So we're talking about the second one of these three great generations. During the time of the Tabi'een, the recording of the hadith was improved and was more widely occurred on a wider basis. Again, if you go back to Dr. Adami's dissertation, he has many examples. He mentions at least 70 or so of the Tabi'een who had their own collections of hadith. During the time of the Tabi'een, the science or the manner of Jarh wa Ta'deel, or checking of the narrations of everybody, was also enhanced. Many of the Tabi'een, when they hear hadith from one person who narrated from somebody else, they would always go back to that first source if he was still alive to check to make sure that the hadith was narrated properly. So all of these things that we find during the time of the Sahaba were enhanced and also still existed during the time of the Tabi'een. And again, we're still talking about the early generations of Islam, or the early years of Islam. What we're saying is that hadith were being preserved and guarded from the time of the Prophet ﷺ. There's no gap, there's no period, say, of 200 years, or 50 years, or like the Gospels, at least 50 years or 40 years, in which there's some gap. We don't know really what happened to the material during that time. But also during the time of the Tabi'een, there was something that you find it during the time of the Sahaba, but you don't really recognize it. And that's the use of the isnad. The use of the isnad. Az-Zuhri once said that, and if you do not use the isnad, and the isnad, by the way, is the chain of narrators from you back to the Prophet ﷺ. He said, if you don't use the isnad, then anybody can say whatever he wants. Then he added, but if you ask him, where did you get it from? He'll be quiet. He'll be silent. He'll not be able to say his source. And these early Tabi'een, they said the isnad is from the deen, or the Tabi'een in general. They said the isnad is from the deen, and it is part of your religion. Because hadith is your religion, so you have to look to those people who you're getting your religion from, to make sure that they are adl, they are people of integrity, and to make sure that they are dhabit. When they transmit hadith, they transmit it properly. So many times during this early period, or during the time of the Tabi'in, I should say, this science or this manner of transmitting hadith or the use of this isnad began to be quite commonplace. That they would always state their authority, who they heard it from, back to the Prophet. So we have in the early period, from the time of the Sahaba, from the time even of the Prophet actually, we have recording of hadith, we have people checking to make sure that people are narrating hadith properly.